The scream that tore through Cecilia Chamberlain's throat died before it could escape as rough hands shoved her against the weathered planks of the Copper Ridge Tavern, and in that moment of pure terror, she understood that running 300 miles across hostile territory had bought her nothing but a few more hours of freedom before Maxwell Cordell finally caught up to her. The year was 1873, and the Arizona frontier had proven far less forgiving than the Philadelphia drawing. Rooms where Celia had once worried about nothing more consequential than which suitor her uncle would approve for her hand in marriage. But those concerns belonged to a different life, a different woman, one who hadn't yet learned that civilized manners meant nothing when faced with a man who believed he owned you simply because he'd paid your gambling-addicted uncle's debts. Celia pressed her spine harder against the rough wood, splinters catching in the fabric of her torn traveling dress as Cordell's shadow fell across her hiding spot behind the tavern. Her chest heaved with exhausted breaths she tried desperately to silence, each lungful of hot desert air burning her throat. The small derringer she'd stolen from her uncle's study 3 weeks ago sat heavy in her pocket. But her trembling hands had already proven useless with the weapon during her first attempt to defend herself 2 towns back. She'd missed Cordell by 3 feet, and he'd laughed, actually laughed, before his men had chased her through the streets until she'd managed to lose them in a freight yard. "Miss Chamberlain." Cordell's voice carried the cultured tones of Boston education wrapped around pure menace. And Celia hated how her name sounded in his mouth, like something he already possessed. "This is becoming tiresome. Your uncle signed the papers. The debt transferred to you upon his death. It's all perfectly legal, I assure you. Now you can come out peacefully, or my associates can retrieve you, and I promise you won't enjoy their methods." His boots crunched on the hard-packed dirt as he moved closer to her hiding place. Through a gap in the boards, Celia could see his polished leather boots, so out of place in this dusty frontier town, and she thought bitterly that everything about Maxwell Cordell was out of place. A predator in gentleman's clothing who'd somehow convinced her dying uncle that selling his niece to settle gambling debts was a reasonable solution. The papers he referenced were real enough. Celia had seen them herself, witnessed her uncle's shaking signature, transferring ownership of his Philadelphia estate, his business interests, and guardianship of his 23-year-old niece to Maxwell Cordell in exchange for the cancellation of $30,000 in gambling debts. Uncle Richard had died 2 days later, his liver finally surrendering to decades of alcohol abuse, and Cordell had arrived at the funeral with those papers and a smile that never reached his cold grey eyes. He'd informed Celia that as her legal guardian, he expected her to honor the arrangement, which included becoming his wife within the month. When she'd refused, he'd shown her just how far his influence reached by having the city marshal turn away her complaints and the family solicitor refuse to see her. So she'd run, taken what little money she could find hidden in her uncle's desk, packed a single carpetbag with practical clothing, and disappeared into the night before Cordell could make good on his promise to lock her in the house until the wedding. She'd made it as far as the train station before his men spotted her, had jumped from the moving train outside Baltimore, stolen a horse she still felt guilty about, and kept moving west, where she'd heard the law was less concerned with Eastern contracts and more interested in survival. But Cordell had followed, always 2 or 3 days behind, his resources seemingly endless, his determination absolute. A second set of footsteps joined Cordell's, heavier, less refined. "She's got to be back here somewhere, Mr. Cordell. Stable boy said he saw a woman matching her description heading this way about 10 minutes ago." The voice belonged to Garrett, one of Cordell's hired men, a brute who'd tried to grab Celia in Santa Fe and still bore the scar on his cheek where she'd slashed him with a letter opener. "Then find her," Cordell snapped, his cultured facade cracking to reveal the rage beneath. "I've chased this ungrateful girl halfway across the continent. I will not be made a fool of by some pampered society chit who doesn't understand the gravity of legal obligation. When we return to Philadelphia, she'll learn proper obedience. even if I have to teach her the hard way." Celia's hand moved to the derringer in her pocket, her fingers closing around the small weapon's grip. She had 2 shots. If she was going to use them, now would be the time. But her hands were shaking so badly, she knew she'd miss again. And this time Cordell wouldn't just laugh. This time he'd take the gun and probably use it on her himself. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to force her breathing to slow, to think of some way out of this trap she'd backed herself into. The sound of movement nearby made her eyes snap open. Through the gap in the boards, she saw a third figure approaching. But this one moved differently, silently, with a grace that seemed impossible for someone crossing the debris-strewn space behind the tavern. At first, Celia thought her desperate mind was conjuring phantoms, because surely no one could move that quietly, that purposefully, without Cordell and Garrett noticing. But then the figure stepped into a shaft of afternoon sunlight, and Celia's breath caught in her throat. He was Apache. Celia knew this immediately from his dress and bearing, though her knowledge of the various tribes was limited to fearful whispers she'd overheard on the train west. He wore traditional clothing, buckskin leggings, and a shirt decorated with intricate beadwork, his long black hair held back by a red cloth band. A knife hung at his belt, and he carried himself with a warrior's confidence, every movement economical and controlled. But it was his face that captured Celia's attention. Strong features marked by high cheekbones and a straight nose. Eyes so dark they appeared black in the shadow. Watching Cordell and Garrett with an expression of careful assessment. Timer had come to Copper Ridge to trade furs and to gather information about the cavalry movements his people needed to track for their safety. The town itself held little interest for him, just another collection of white settlers trying to carve existence from land that had belonged to his people for generations. He'd been preparing to leave when he'd noticed the well-dressed Eastern man and his hired muscle searching behind the buildings with the focused intensity of hunters closing in on prey. Curiosity had drawn him closer, and then he'd seen her, the woman pressed against the tavern wall like a cornered rabbit, terror written in every line of her body. He'd seen fear before, had seen it in the faces of his enemies, in the eyes of settlers who foolishly tried to cross Apache territory without respect. But this was different. This woman's fear was the kind that came from prolonged pursuit, from knowing that capture meant something worse than death. Timer recognized that particular brand of terror because he'd seen it in the faces of captives taken by raiding parties, the ones who understood exactly what awaited them if they couldn't escape. Something in her desperate courage, the way she clutched that small weapon despite her shaking hands, spoke to something in Timer that went beyond curiosity. "I'm losing patience, Miss Chamberlain," Cordell called out, and Timer noted how the woman flinched at the sound of her name. "Come out now, and I'll overlook this embarrassing episode. Continue hiding, and I'll let Garrett here drag you out by your hair if necessary. I'm sure the good citizens of Copper Ridge won't interfere with a man retrieving his wayward fiancée." The word fiancée was clearly a lie. Timer had spent enough time around white settlers to recognize the signs of an unwanted pursuit, and everything about this situation screamed predator and prey rather than lover's quarrel. The woman called Chamberlain was no man's willing intended. That much was clear from her body language alone. Timer made his decision in that instant, the same instinct that had guided him through countless battles and raids, now telling him that walking away from this would be wrong. He stepped forward, deliberately making noise this time, letting his moccasins scuff against the dirt. Cordell and Garrett whirled toward him, both men's hands moving toward their weapons. Timer kept his own hands visible and relaxed, knowing that attacking would bring the town's wrath down on him, and likely on the woman he'd decided to help. Better to approach this with words first, though he suspected words wouldn't be enough. "You're making much noise behind this place," Timer said in carefully measured English, his accent noticeable but his words clear. He'd learned the language from a missionary woman who tried to convert his band before giving up and leaving them in peace, and while he rarely used it, The skill proved valuable in situations like this. The owner inside is angry, says you disturb his customers. Cordell's expression shifted from surprise to disdain in an instant. This doesn't concern you, Apache. Move along before you find yourself in more trouble than you can handle. His hand remained near his pistol, and Garrett had actually drawn his weapon, holding it pointed toward the ground, but ready to raise it at any provocation. Timer glanced past them to where the woman still pressed against the wall, her blue eyes now fixed on him with a mixture of hope and terror. She was beautiful, he noted distantly, even disheveled and frightened, with auburn hair escaping from its pins and a face that would have been gentle in repose. But it was her spirit that intrigued him, the way she held that pathetic little weapon like it might actually save her. The stubborn set of her jaw that said she'd keep fighting, even when fighting seemed pointless. "The tavern owner is my friend," Timer continued, the lie coming easily. "He asks me to make these men leave. This is not good for business, having men with guns searching behind buildings. Frightens the customers." He took another step forward, positioning himself so that he could reach the woman before Cordell could if it came to violence. His hand remained near his knife, and he caught the moment when Cordell recognized him as a genuine threat rather than a minor annoyance. "Listen here," Garrett started, raising his pistol slightly. But Cordell stopped him with a raised hand. The well-dressed man's eyes had narrowed, calculating odds and outcomes. Timer knew what he was seeing. An Apache warrior in prime fighting condition, clearly comfortable with violence, standing between him and his quarry in a town that probably wouldn't care much if an Eastern gentleman met with an unfortunate accident while harassing locals. "We're simply looking for someone," Cordell said, his tone shifting to something approximating reasonableness. "A young woman, confused and frightened, who ran away from family obligations. She's not well mentally, and we're here to bring her home where she can receive proper care. Surely you understand the importance of family responsibility." The lie was smooth, practiced, and might have worked on someone who didn't have eyes to see the woman's reaction. But Timer saw her stiffen, saw rage flash across her features before fear reasserted itself. Whatever story Cordell was selling, she clearly had a very different version. And Timer found himself inclined to believe her silent testimony over this man's polished words. "I do not see any confused woman here," Timer replied flatly. "I see only two men with guns making threats behind a tavern. This seems like behavior that brings the marshal, yes? Perhaps we should ask him about family responsibility." It was a calculated risk. Timer had no idea whether this town's marshal would side with him or with the Eastern men. But the threat seemed to give Cordell pause. For a long moment, tension stretched between them, tight as a bowstring. Garrett's pistol remained half-raised, his finger near the trigger. Cordell's jaw worked as he weighed his options. And the woman, Chamberlain, watched them all with the desperate intensity of someone witnessing her fate being decided by strangers. Then slowly Cordell smiled, and it was perhaps the most unsettling expression Timer had ever witnessed on a human face. "Of course," Cordell said smoothly. "We wouldn't want to cause any trouble in your friend's establishment. Garrett, put the weapon away. We'll continue our search elsewhere. I'm sure Miss Chamberlain will turn up eventually. She can't run forever." The threat in those words was unmistakable. A promise that this pursuit wasn't over, merely postponed. Cordell tipped his hat in a mockery of courtesy and turned to leave. Garrett following reluctantly after one last threatening glare at Timer. Timer waited until they'd rounded the corner of the tavern, and their footsteps had faded before turning his full attention to the woman. She'd sagged against the wall, the derringer finally lowering in her shaking hand, her eyes closed as she took great gulping breaths. He could see tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks, though she made no sound of crying. This was someone who'd learned to suffer silently, who'd been terrified for so long that even temporary reprieve brought this kind of overwhelming relief. "They will return," Timer said quietly, and her eyes snapped open, fixing on him with new fear. He held up a hand in a calming gesture. "Not now. But that man, he is Hunter. He will not stop until he has what he seeks, or until he believes the cost too high. You understand this, yes? She nodded, swallowing hard before speaking. Yes, I understand. He's followed me for 3 weeks across half the country. I thought if I could just get far enough west, somewhere his money and influence didn't reach. She trailed off, and Timer could hear the despair in her voice, the understanding that distance alone wouldn't save her from a man with Cordell's resources and determination. What does he want from you? Timer asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Men like Cordell always wanted the same things: power, possession, control over something or someone they viewed as rightfully theirs. He has papers, she said bitterly. Legal documents that say I belong to him, that my uncle sold guardianship of me to satisfy gambling debts. He wants to marry me, to own me completely under the law. When I refused, he made it clear he would take what he wanted regardless of my wishes. Her voice broke slightly on the last words, but she forced herself to continue. I ran, it's all I could think to do, but he keeps finding me, and I don't know how much longer I can keep running. Timer studied her for a long moment. This exhausted Eastern woman who'd somehow found the courage to flee across a continent despite obvious terror. There was something admirable in her stubborn refusal to surrender, even when surrender might have been the easier path. It reminded him of trapped animals he'd seen, the ones who would gnaw off their own leg rather than accept captivity. Such spirit deserved better than to be crushed by a man like Cordell. You cannot stay here, he said finally. This town is too small, too open. He will find you again before nightfall, and next time I may not be here to interrupt. You need to go somewhere he cannot easily follow, somewhere his papers and his money mean nothing. He saw understanding dawn in her eyes, followed immediately by uncertainty and fear of a different kind. You mean go with you, she said slowly, into Apache territory. But I've heard stories about what happens to white women taken by Indians. I've heard... She stopped, clearly torn between fear of Cordell and fear of what Timer might represent, caught between two different kinds of danger. Stories, Timer said with something that might have been amusement. Yes, white people tell many stories about my people, most of them lies meant to justify taking our land and killing our families. But I will tell you truth. You come with me, I take you to my village. You will be safe there. No white man's papers have power in Apache land. This Cordell, he will not follow where he knows he cannot win. And then what? She asked, her voice steadier now, the core of steel in her becoming visible through the fear. I live among strangers whose language I don't speak, whose customs I don't know, forever looking over my shoulder. Or you stay here and belong to that man, Timer replied bluntly. Those are your choices, woman. Neither is good, but one gives you life and possibility. The other gives you only suffering. Choose. He could see her struggling with the decision, weighing unknown dangers against certain doom, and part of him admired that she was still trying to think logically, despite her obvious exhaustion and terror. A sound from the street beyond the tavern made them both tense. Voices, one of them Cordell's, speaking to someone about a missing woman. Time was running out. Timer made a quick decision and stepped closer to her, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening despite his urgency. We must go now. You decide quickly, or the choice is made for you. Celia looked into the Apache warrior's dark eyes and saw something there she hadn't expected. Genuine concern, an offer of protection without obvious strings attached. The promise of safety from a stranger who had no reason to help her, except that he'd seen someone in need and responded. It was more than anyone else had offered her in 3 weeks of running. She thought of Cordell's cold smile, of Garrett's brutal hands, of a future spent as a possession rather than a person. Then she made her choice. All right, she whispered, shoving the derringer back into her pocket and straightening her spine. I'll come with you. But I warn you, if you're lying about your intentions, I still have this gun, and next time I won't miss. It was an empty threat, and they both knew it. But making it helped her feel less helpless, gave her the illusion of control in a situation where she had virtually none. Timer's lips quirked in what might have been a smile. Good, you have spirit. You will need it where we are going. Now stay close and move quietly. If we are stopped, let me speak." He led her away from the tavern's back wall, moving with that same silent grace she'd noticed before, choosing a path that kept them behind buildings and away from the main street where Cordell was surely still searching. They moved through Copper Ridge like ghosts, Taima's knowledge of how to move unseen proving invaluable as they navigated alleys and backlots. Celia struggled to keep up in her impractical traveling dress, the heavy fabric catching on debris and slowing her down, but she bit back complaints and forced herself onward. Behind them, she could hear raised voices, Cordell's rising in frustration as his search continued to prove fruitless. The sound sent fresh terror through her veins, lending strength to exhausted legs. At the edge of town, Taima stopped beside a small grove of cottonwood trees where a painted horse waited, hobbled but alert. The animal raised its head at their approach, and Taima made a soft sound that seemed to calm it. He removed the hobbles with practiced efficiency, then turned to Celia with an expression that suggested he'd just realized a potential problem. "You can ride?" "Yes," Celia said, grateful that her uncle had at least provided her with riding lessons during her youth, though she'd never attempted to ride astride in a dress. "Though I may need help mounting." Taima solved this problem by simply grasping her waist and lifting her onto the horse's back as if she weighed nothing. A casual display of strength that reminded Celia just how completely she was now dependent on this stranger's goodwill. He swung up behind her with fluid ease, gathering the reins and turning the horse away from Copper Ridge. As they began to move, Celia looked back at the town, at what had briefly seemed like it might be sanctuary, and wondered if she'd just made a terrible mistake or the first good decision since her uncle had signed those cursed papers. Either way, there was no going back now. She was leaving the world she knew behind, heading into territory she'd been taught to fear, guided by a man whose name she didn't even know. "I'm Celia," she said, as the horse settled into a ground-eating trot. "Celia Chamberlain, though I suppose formal introductions seem ridiculous at this point," she felt rather than saw his nod of acknowledgement behind her. "Taima," he replied simply. "It means crash of thunder in my tongue. My mother heard thunder when I was born and said it was a sign I would have a warrior's spirit." There was something almost companionable in the way he shared this, as if he was trying to ease her fear with the ordinariness of conversation. "Thank you, Taima," Celia said softly, and meant it despite her lingering uncertainty, "for helping me back there. You didn't have to get involved." She felt him shift slightly behind her, his voice thoughtful when he responded, "In my tribe, we have saying, the strong protect the weak not because they are weak, but because protection is what makes us strong. You needed help. I could give it. This is enough reason." The philosophy was simple but profound, and Celia found herself blinking back tears at the kindness implicit in those words. They rode in silence after that, the horse carrying them steadily away from Copper Ridge and into the wild lands beyond. Celia didn't look back again, keeping her eyes fixed on the horizon ahead, on whatever future awaited her in Apache territory. Behind them, the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson. And in Copper Ridge, Maxwell Cordell stood in the middle of the main street, his face twisted with rage as he realized his prize had slipped through his fingers once again, this time with help from the very savages he'd spent the afternoon dismissing as insignificant obstacles. But Celia knew nothing of this as the distance grew between her and her pursuer. She knew only the steady rhythm of the horse beneath her, the solid presence of the warrior at her back, and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd finally found someone who could keep the promise that Cordell would never touch her again. The desert night fell with startling swiftness, transforming the landscape from burnished gold to deep purple shadow in what seemed like moments. Celia clung to the horse's mane as Taima guided them through terrain that looked identical in every direction. Endless stretches of sand and scrub, broken occasionally by towering saguaro cacti that stood like silent sentinels in the gathering darkness. Her body ached from hours of riding, muscles protesting the unaccustomed position and constant movement. But she bit back complaints and focused on staying conscious and upright. They'd been traveling for perhaps 5 hours when Timer finally slowed the horse to a walk, his hand touching Celia's shoulder briefly to get her attention. "We stop here for the night. Too dangerous to continue in darkness over ground I do not know perfectly. The horse needs rest and you look ready to fall." His assessment was accurate, though Celia wanted to protest that she could continue. Her pride, however, couldn't overcome the simple fact that her entire body trembled with exhaustion. Taima dismounted with his characteristic fluid grace, then reached up to help Celia down. Her legs buckled the moment her feet touched ground, and only his quick reflexes kept her from collapsing entirely. He steadied her with hands on her waist until she found her balance, his expression showing neither judgment nor pity. "Sit," he instructed, guiding her to a flat rock near a cluster of desert shrubs. "I will make camp." Celia sank onto the rock gratefully, watching as Timer moved through tasks with practiced efficiency. He hobbled the horse near a patch of sparse grass, then began gathering dead wood from the surrounding area. Within minutes, he'd constructed a small fire using methods Celia couldn't quite follow, striking sparks from flint and steel into a nest of dry grass that caught and spread to the carefully arranged kindling. The flames provided warmth against the surprising chill of the desert night. From a leather pack that had been secured to the horse, Timer produced strips of dried meat and a leather water skin. He handed both to Celia without comment, then settled himself on the opposite side of the fire. The silence between them stretched uncomfortably, filled with unasked questions and uncertain future. Celia chewed the jerky, which was tougher and more strongly flavored than anything she'd eaten before. "How far is your village?" she asked finally, her voice sounding strange in the vast emptiness surrounding them. "How long will we travel?" The practical question seemed safer than the deeper ones swirling in her mind, the ones about what exactly she'd gotten herself into. Timer looked up from the fire, his dark eyes unreadable in the flickering light. 3 days if we push hard. 4 if we travel at comfortable pace. The land we cross tomorrow is more difficult, hills and canyons that slow progress. But this is good, because it also slows any who might follow. He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "You have questions. Many questions, I think. Ask them now before we reach my people." The invitation was unexpected, and Celia found herself uncertain where to begin. Finally, she settled on the most immediate worry. "What will happen when we reach your village? Will they accept me, a white woman? I've heard stories about captives, about how they're treated." She couldn't quite meet his eyes as she voiced this fear. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." "Stories," Timer said, and there was a hint of bitterness in his voice. "Always stories. Yes, my people take captive sometimes, usually in revenge for wrongs done to us, for villages burned and families killed by your soldiers. These captives are made to work, to serve. But you are not captive. You asked for help and I gave it freely. This means you come as guest under my protection. Any who harm you answer to me." The steel in his voice on those last words suggested that answering to him would not be a pleasant experience. "But surely your people won't be happy about you bringing a white woman into their camp," Celia pressed, needing to understand what awaited her. "Surely there will be those who see me as enemy." Timer was quiet for a long moment, feeding small sticks into the fire. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of painful history. "My sister was killed 2 summers ago by settlers who found her gathering herbs near their settlement. They shot her for sport, left her body for animals to find. My mother still weeps for her. My father's brother was hanged by cavalry after being falsely accused of stealing horses." He looked directly at Celia. "Yes, there will be some who see you and remember only pain. Who will want revenge for all that has been taken from us? Celia's throat tightened with a mixture of guilt and fear. She'd had nothing to do with those atrocities, had lived her sheltered Philadelphia life, unaware of the violence being perpetrated in the name of westward expansion. Then why help me? Why bring me to your village, if it will cause problems? Because strength is not found in adding to the cycle of suffering, Timer replied firmly. My grandfather taught me this before he died. He said that true warriors protect life, not just take it. That honor comes from choosing the harder path. He paused, then added more softly, and because when I saw you against that wall, I saw my sister's fear in the moments before she died. I could not save her. Perhaps I can save you. The raw honesty of his words struck Celia silent. Tears pricked her eyes, exhaustion and emotion finally overwhelming the rigid control she'd maintained for weeks. I'm sorry, she said quietly. For your sister, for all of it. I know my words can't change anything, but I am truly sorry. Timar nodded, accepting her sympathy with grave dignity. You did not kill her. But you benefit from the system that did, whether you wish to or not. This is truth you must understand, if you are to live among my people. Your presence will remind them of losses they cannot forget. You must be respectful, humble, willing to learn our ways without judgment. His expression softened slightly. But you have already shown courage by running from the man who would own you. My people respect courage. Show them this spirit and you may find acceptance. And if I don't? Celia asked, voicing the fear she'd been trying to suppress. Then I will take you somewhere else, Timer said simply. I gave you my protection. This is not gift I give lightly or take back easily. Where you go, my protection goes until you are truly safe. He met her eyes across the fire. But I do not think it will come to this. My chief is wise. They will see that you are refugee seeker, not invader. Tell me about your village, she said, trying to shift to safer topics. What should I expect when we arrive? Timar spent the next while describing his band, a group of about 70 people, including warriors, women, children, and elders. He spoke of his chief, a man named Nochalo, who had led them for 15 years with wisdom and strength. He described the daily life of the village, the way responsibilities were divided, the customs that governed interactions. The women will be curious about you, Timer said. They will want to touch your hair, examine your clothes, ask questions through gestures. Let them. Their curiosity is not hostile. My aunt Desba is headwoman among the women. If she accepts you, others will follow her lead. Show her respect, offer to help with work, prove you are not useless Eastern flower who expects to be served. I can work, Celia said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. I can sew, cook, clean, tend gardens. You will learn new skills, Timer said. How to prepare hides, gather desert plants for food and medicine, make baskets and pottery. The women will teach you if you show willingness. But I warn you, Apache life is hard. We do not have the comforts you are used to. No fine dresses, no servants, no easy living. We work every day to survive. This will not change because you are guest. I understand, Celia replied, though she suspected she truly didn't, not yet. Understanding would come with experience, with calluses on her hands and exhaustion in her bones. The fire burned lower as they talked, flames reducing to glowing coals. Above them, the desert sky blazed with more stars than Celia had ever seen, the Milky Way stretching like a river of light across the heavens. In Philadelphia, city lights had obscured such displays. But here in the wilderness, the universe revealed itself in all its vast indifference to human concerns. You should sleep, Timer said, breaking the companionable silence. Tomorrow's ride is harder through country that will test your endurance. I will keep watch. Make sure we are not followed. He added more wood to the fire. Celia wanted to argue that she could take a watch shift too, but exhaustion was pulling at her like a physical weight. What about you? When will you rest? Apache warriors learn to go long periods without sleep when necessary, Timer replied with a slight smile. This is not hardship for me. Besides, I will feel better knowing you are safe while you rest. He gestured to a spot near the fire where he'd spread a blanket. Sleep there, close to the warmth. I will wake you if danger comes. Celia moved to the designated spot, grateful for the blanket even though it was rough wool. She lay down, using her folded shawl as a pillow, and pulled the blanket around herself. From this position, she could see Timer silhouetted against the starry sky, sitting with his back to a large rock, his rifle across his knees. "Timer," she said softly, "one last question needing to be asked. Why did you really help me today? The truth, not the philosophy about warriors and protection." He was quiet for so long that Celia thought he might not answer. Then his voice came through the darkness, thoughtful and honest. "Because I'm tired of watching people suffer when I have power to prevent it. Because my people are hunted and harmed every day, and I cannot save them all, but perhaps I can save one person from one predator. Because in this broken world, choosing kindness over cruelty is itself an act of resistance." He paused, then added more softly, "And because something in your eyes reminded me that we are all refugees in our own ways, all running from something, all deserving of a chance to find peace." The profound simplicity of his answer brought fresh tears to Celia's eyes. She blinked them away, her throat too tight for speech. Instead, she simply whispered, "Thank you," and let her eyes finally close, trusting in the protection of a stranger who'd proven more honorable than any civilized man she'd known. Sleep came quickly, despite the hard ground and unfamiliar sounds. Celia's dreams were fragmented, images of Cordel's cold smile mixing with visions of hostile faces and unknown dangers. But each time she stirred toward waking, she would see Timer's silhouette still keeping watch, and the sight would ease her back into deeper rest. Dawn broke with spectacular color, the eastern sky transforming from deep purple to brilliant orange and gold. Celia woke to find Timer crouched by the fire, brewing something in a small pot that smelled strongly of herbs. He glanced over when he heard her stirring. "Good morning," he said in English, then added something in his own language that sounded like a greeting. "Good morning," Celia replied, sitting up and immediately wincing at the protest of abused muscles. Every part of her body ached from yesterday's ride. She forced herself to stand, refusing to show weakness. "What's that you're making?" "Tea from desert plants," Timer explained. "It gives strength and helps with pain from long riding. You drink, it will help." He poured the steaming liquid into a wooden cup and handed it to her. The tea tasted bitter and earthy, nothing like the refined blends she'd enjoyed in Philadelphia. But Celia drank it gratefully. They broke camp efficiently, Timer teaching Celia how to properly secure the bedroll and pack. He corrected her mistakes patiently, showing her the proper knots and explaining why certain methods worked better. It was clear he intended for her to learn practical skills, not simply be carried along as helpless cargo. The day's ride proved even more challenging than Timer had warned. They left the relatively flat desert behind and entered a region of steep hills and narrow canyons, the landscape becoming increasingly rugged. Rock formations towered above them in shades of red and orange. They forded streams still running from spring snowmelt, the water shockingly cold. Around midday, they stopped to rest the horse and eat a sparse meal. As they sat in the shade of a canyon wall, Celia noticed Timer studying the surrounding landscape with intense focus. "What is it?" she asked, alarm creeping into her voice. "Do you see something?" "Not see, feel," Timer replied. "Something is not right." "Too quiet, no birds calling." As soon as he said it, Celia realized he was correct. The canyon was eerily silent. Timer stood slowly, his hand moving to his rifle. "Stay here against the rock. Do not move until I return." Before Celia could respond, he'd moved away, seeming to melt into the landscape. Celia pressed her back against the canyon wall, her heart hammering as she waited. Minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. A sound finally broke the silence, a low rumble like distant thunder, but the sky was cloudless. The rumble grew louder, and suddenly Celia understood. The ground beneath her feet began to vibrate, and she looked up in horror to see water surging around a bend in the canyon, a wall of brown liquid carrying debris in its churning mass. "Climb!" Timer's voice shouted, And then he was there, grabbing her arm and half dragging her toward a narrow crack in the canyon wall.
Up now, quickly!
He boosted her into the crevice, and Celia scrambled upward, her hands finding holes in the rough rock as the roar of approaching water grew deafening. She climbed desperately, her muscles screaming, her fingernails breaking against stone. The water hit with tremendous force, filling the canyon floor and surging up the walls. Celia climbed higher, driven by pure survival instinct. Finally, she reached a ledge wide enough to crouch on, her chest heaving. The water below was still rising, reaching toward her perch. She pressed herself against the rock face and prayed the ledge was high enough. Across the canyon, perhaps 30 feet away, she spotted Timer on a similar ledge, the horse beside him. He caught her eye and made a gesture telling her to stay put. Celia nodded. She waited, clinging to her precarious perch, watching the floodwaters surge below. The water raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes before beginning to recede. As the water level dropped, Timer carefully guided the horse down. Once they were safely down, he turned his attention to Celia. "Can you climb down?" he called up. "Or do you need help?" Celia looked down at the route she'd climbed and felt her stomach drop. "I think I need help," she admitted. Timer secured the horse, then began climbing toward her with confident ease. When he reached her ledge, he positioned himself below her and talked her through the descent, his voice patient as he guided her feet to safe holds. Eventually they both stood on the canyon floor, soaked and muddy but alive. "That was terrifying," Celia said, her voice shaking. "How did you know it was coming?" "Storm in the mountains sends water through canyons like this," Timer explained. "Sky can be clear here, but water still comes." The silence of birds warned me. He checked their supplies, assessing damage. As they prepared to continue, Celia found herself marveling at Timer's competence and the depth of knowledge required to survive in this land. In Philadelphia, survival meant navigating social hierarchies. Here it meant reading signs in nature that could mean the difference between life and death. "Thank you," she said quietly as they resumed their journey. "For the second time, you've saved my life. I'm beginning to understand just how much I have to learn." Timer glanced back at her, and for the first time, she saw him smile. "You learn quickly or you die quickly in Apache territory. But I think you are a survivor, Celia Chamberlain. You ran far from comfort because you valued freedom more. This tells me you have strength you do not yet know you possess." As the afternoon sun beat down, drying their wet clothes, she found herself believing him. The flash flood had been terrifying, but she'd survived it, had kept her head enough to climb to safety. That had to count for something. They rode on through the afternoon, the landscape gradually shifting as they climbed toward higher elevations. The air grew cooler, pine trees beginning to appear among the rock. By the time Timer called another halt for the night, they'd left the desert canyons behind and entered country that reminded Celia of mountain wilderness. This camp was different from the previous night. Sheltered in a grove of ponderosa pines with a small spring, Timer allowed a larger fire, saying they were now in Apache territory where settlers rarely ventured. As darkness fell, Celia felt some of the tension that had gripped her since fleeing Philadelphia finally begin to ease. "Tomorrow we reach my village," Timer said as they shared their evening meal. "Are you ready?" Celia considered her answer carefully. "I don't know if anyone can be truly ready for something so completely outside their experience. But I'm willing to try, willing to learn, willing to work for acceptance." She met his eyes across the fire. "And I'm grateful for the chance, whatever comes of it." Timer nodded, seeming satisfied. "Then tomorrow we arrive, and your new life begins." The Apache village materialized through the morning mist like something from a dream. A cluster of wickiups arranged in careful patterns among towering pines at the base of a red rock cliff. Smoke rose from cooking fires in thin columns, and Celia could hear the sounds of daily life drifting toward them. Children's laughter, the rhythmic pounding of something being worked, voices calling to one another in a language that was musical and completely foreign. Her stomach twisted with nervousness as Timer guided the horse down the final slope toward his home, toward a community that had no reason to welcome her. As they drew closer, the activity in the village seemed to pause. Women straightened from their work, children stopped their games to stare, and several men emerged from wiki-ups with expressions that ranged from curious to openly hostile. Timer sat straighter in the saddle, his posture shifting to something more formal. He called out something in Apache, his voice carrying across the camp with clear authority, and Celia caught her name in the flow of unfamiliar words. An older man stepped forward from the largest wiki-up, his bearing suggesting leadership. This had to be Nochalo, the chief Timer had spoken of. The man was perhaps 60, his weathered face marked by deep lines, his long grey hair braided with red cloth and feathers. He listened intently as Timer spoke, his dark eyes shifting occasionally to where Celia remained mounted, feeling exposed under the scrutiny of gathered villagers. The conversation between Timer and Nochalo lasted several minutes, the chief asking questions that Timer answered with patient thoroughness. Other men had gathered now, forming a loose circle, and Celia recognized this as a council deciding her fate. She forced herself to sit calmly, despite the fear churning in her gut, to keep her expression neutral and respectful even as hostile glares from some warriors made her skin crawl. Finally, Nochalo raised a hand, silencing whatever objection one of the younger warriors had been voicing. He spoke directly to Timer, then turned his attention fully to Celia. He approached the horse with dignified slowness, studying her with eyes that seemed to see past surface appearances. Celia met his gaze steadily, remembering Timer's advice about showing respect but not weakness. Nochalo said something in Apache, his voice carrying a question. Timer translated. "My chief asks why you run. He asks what drives a white woman into Apache lands, away from her own people." Celia took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I run from a man who believes he owns me, who has papers that say I must marry him to satisfy debts I never made. I run because staying meant losing everything I am, becoming property instead of person." She paused, then added, "I know I have no right to ask sanctuary among people who have suffered because of my race. But Timer offered help when I had nowhere else to turn, and I am grateful for any mercy your people might show me." Timer translated her words, and Celia watched Nochalo's expression carefully. The chief listened without interruption, then asked another question. He asks if you understand that white woman's law means nothing here, that Apache ways are not your ways, that life among us will be harder than anything you have known. "I understand," Celia replied steadily. "I ask only for a chance to prove I can learn, that I can work, that I will not be burdened to your people. I've no expectations of comfort or special treatment, just safety from the man who hunts me." The chief studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly and spoke to the assembled group. His words seemed to settle something. Several warriors still looked unhappy, and one in particular, a man younger than Timer, with a scar running down his left cheek, said something sharp and angry. Nochalo's response was brief, but carried unmistakable authority, and the scarred warrior fell silent, though his hostile glare at Celia intensified. Timer returned to help Celia dismount, his hands steadying her as her stiff legs nearly buckled. "You may stay," he said quietly. "The chief has granted you sanctuary as my guest. But understand, not everyone is happy with this decision. The man who spoke against you, his name is Kuruk. His wife was killed by cavalry 2 months ago. He sees you and sees only enemy. Stay away from him if you can." Before Celia could respond, a group of women approached, led by an older woman whose confident bearing identified her as someone important. This had to be Desba, the head woman Timer had mentioned. She circled Celia like a hawk examining prey, her weathered hands reaching out to touch Celia's auburn hair, to finger the fabric of her torn dress, to examine her soft, uncalloused hands with what might have been disdain. She spoke rapidly to Timer, gesturing at Celia. "My aunt says you look weak, that your hands have never done real work, that your skin will burn in the sun." Timer translated. "She says you will need much teaching if you are to be useful." He paused, then added with something that might have been amusement. But she also says that any woman brave enough to run across half the territory alone has spirit worth cultivating. You may prove less useless than you appear. It was perhaps the most backhanded acceptance Celia had ever received, but she recognized it as a chance to prove herself. Tell your aunt I am grateful for her willingness to teach me, and that I will work as hard as necessary to learn your ways. Desba listened to Taima's translation, then nodded once sharply and barked something that sounded like an order. Two younger women immediately stepped forward, gesturing for Celia to follow. Taima caught her arm gently. They will take you to prepare. You cannot wear those clothes here. The women will find you proper clothing and show you where you will sleep. He added, do not resist their help, even if their curiosity seems intrusive. They are testing you, seeing if you will adapt. Show flexibility. This is important. Celia nodded and followed the two Apache women, refusing to look back at Taima, even though every instinct screamed to maintain that connection to something familiar. The women led her to a wickiup at the edge of the village, gesturing for her to enter the dome-shaped structure. Inside, it was dim and smelled of smoke and leather. One of the women, younger with a round face and quick smile, began speaking rapidly while gesturing at Celia's dress. When Celia didn't immediately respond, the woman simply reached out and began unfastening the buttons with practiced efficiency. Celia's first instinct was to pull away, but she remembered Taima's warning. She forced herself to stand still, to allow these strangers to remove her Eastern clothing until she stood in only her undergarments. The women examined each discarded piece with curiosity, exclaiming over the many buttons and delicate lace. They seemed particularly bemused by her corset, clearly unable to comprehend why anyone would willingly constrain themselves in such a garment. The older woman produced a simple dress made of soft deerskin, decorated with modest beadwork. She held it up against Celia, then helped her pull it on. The dress felt strange, designed for ease of movement rather than fashion. They also provided moccasins, the soft footwear feeling almost like going barefoot. Once dressed, the round-faced woman produced a bone comb and gestured for Celia to sit. What followed was an extended session of hair manipulation that was simultaneously painful and oddly intimate. The woman worked through tangles in Celia's auburn hair with patient thoroughness, occasionally calling the other woman over to examine the unusual color. Finally, they plaited her hair into two long braids, weaving in bits of colored cloth and a single white shell. When they were satisfied, they produced a piece of polished metal that served as a mirror. Celia barely recognized herself. Gone was the proper Philadelphia lady, replaced by someone who looked like she might actually belong here. The transformation was startling. The women led her back outside, where the village was now in full activity. Everywhere Celia looked, people were engaged in purposeful work. Women tended fires and prepared food, scraped hides, wove baskets. Men worked on weapons or returned from hunting. Children ran between wickiups, their games incorporating practical skills. Desba appeared, examining Celia's transformation with critical eyes before nodding approval. She spoke to the two younger women, who immediately guided Celia toward a large flat stone, where several women were grinding something in stone mortars. Desba demonstrated the motion, the rhythmic pounding that reduced dried corn into meal, then handed Celia a stone pestle and pointed to a pile of corn kernels. Celia positioned herself as the other women had and began to pound the corn. Within minutes her arms were aching. Within half an hour her shoulders burned and her hands were developing blisters where they gripped the stone pestle. But around her, women maintained the same steady rhythm without apparent effort, their conversation flowing easily while their hands never stopped working. She forced herself to continue despite the pain, to match their rhythm as best she could. She knew this was a test. Complaining or stopping would confirm she was too weak for Apache life. So she gritted her teeth and kept pounding, even as blisters formed and broke, and her entire upper body screamed in protest. By midday, when the women finally rose to prepare the noon meal, Celia's hands were bleeding, her arms trembled with exhaustion, and she felt dizzy from pain and hunger. But she'd ground nearly as much corn as some of the other women. Desba examined Celia's damaged hands with an expression that might have been approval, then produced a clay pot containing some kind of salve that she rubbed into the wounds with surprising gentleness. Tamar appeared at Celia's elbow, translating Desba's words. "She says you are stubborn, which is good. Stubborn women survive. Smart women know when to stop before they do permanent damage. You should have asked for cloth to wrap your hands." But there was also respect in his eyes as he looked at her bloodied palms. "I didn't know how to ask," Celia admitted hoarsely. "I don't speak your language, can't understand when people offer help. I'm stumbling blind through every interaction." Taima nodded, understanding. "This will change. I will teach you our language and others will help. But learning takes time." He guided her toward where food was being distributed. "For now, eat, rest. Tomorrow brings new challenges." The food was unfamiliar but surprisingly good, a rich stew of meat and wild vegetables. She sat with the women who had dressed her, the round-faced one introducing herself through gestures as Kimi, while the older woman was Nalte. They seemed pleased by Celia's enjoyment of the meal, offering her seconds and pointing to various ingredients while speaking their names slowly. After the meal, Kimi took her arm and led her toward the edge of the village, where women were harvesting plants from the surrounding forest. They carried large baskets and moved through the landscape with confident knowledge. Desba gestured for Celia to follow as they ranged up the slope. What followed was an intensive lesson in Apache botany. The women showed Celia which plants were edible, which had medicinal properties, which should be avoided. They demonstrated how to harvest roots without killing the plant, how to identify young shoots, how to find signs that indicated water sources. It was overwhelming, but Celia tried desperately to remember everything. Nalte seemed particularly patient, repeating plant names multiple times and using simple gestures to indicate uses. She showed Celia how certain leaves could be crushed and applied to wounds, how specific roots could ease stomach ailments, how the inner bark of particular trees could be eaten in emergencies. Each lesson was practical and vital. As the afternoon wore on and their baskets filled with the day's harvest, Celia found herself relaxing into the rhythm despite her exhaustion. There was something peaceful about moving through the forest with these women, about the shared purpose and patient instruction. For the first time since fleeing Philadelphia, she felt like she might actually have a path forward. They were heading back toward the village when Kuruk appeared on the path ahead. The scarred warrior who had spoken against Celia's presence stood blocking their way, his expression dark with anger. He spoke in rapid Apache, his tone aggressive. The women clustered closer together, Desba moving to place herself slightly in front of Celia in a protective gesture. Desba responded sharply, her voice carrying authority. But Kuruk was beyond listening. He took a step forward, his hand moving toward the knife at his belt, his eyes fixed on Celia with undisguised hatred. In that moment, Celia understood that this man didn't just dislike her presence. He actively wanted her dead, wanted revenge for his wife's murder visited upon her. Before the situation could escalate, Taima appeared as if materializing from the forest itself. He positioned himself between Kuruk and the women, his posture radiating controlled violence. The two warriors faced each other in tense silence. Kuruk said something contemptuous, and Taima's response was brief but definitive. For a moment, Celia thought they would actually fight. But Kuruk finally stepped aside, spitting in the dirt near Celia's feet before stalking away. The women released collective breaths, Desba placing a hand briefly on Taima's arm in thanks, before leading her group past the confrontation site. That evening, as the sun set and cooking fires were lit, Taima found Celia sitting outside her assigned wickiup, her bandaged hands resting in her lap. He settled beside her without invitation. "Kuruk will be problem," he said without preamble. "His grief is still fresh. His anger has no outlet except you." I have told him that harming you means facing me, but words may not be enough if his rage overcomes his reason. Maybe I should leave, Celia said quietly. Go somewhere else before my presence causes violence within your community. No, Taima replied firmly. Running has not solved your problems before. Here at least you have community forming around you. I saw how the women worked with you today, how Desba protected you. This is beginning of acceptance. He paused. Besides, I gave you a promise. You will never need to fear anyone again. I do not break my promises. The certainty in his voice made Celia's throat tight with emotion. Why does my safety matter so much to you? You barely know me. Taima was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried deep conviction. My grandfather used to say that we become our choices, that each decision to help or harm shapes who we are becoming. When I found you hiding, I had a choice. Walk away and remain unchanged, or help and become something more. I chose to become the kind of man who protects those who need protecting. Your safety matters because I chose to make it matter. The simple profundity of his philosophy struck Celia deeply. Thank you, she said softly, for choosing to help, for making a promise and keeping it. I will do everything I can to prove worthy of your protection. Taima nodded, seeming satisfied. They sat together in companionable silence as full darkness fell and stars began to emerge. Around them, the village settled into night rhythms. For the first time since leaving Philadelphia, Celia felt something approaching peace, a sense that maybe she'd found a place where she could stop running and start building a life. 3 weeks had passed since Celia's arrival in the Apache village, 3 weeks of backbreaking work and gradual, grudging acceptance from most of the community. Her hands had calloused over, the blisters healing into tough skin that could grip tools and materials without bleeding. Her pale complexion had darkened from constant sun exposure, and her body had grown lean and strong from the endless physical demands of Apache life. She could now identify dozens of edible and medicinal plants, could prepare hides with reasonable competence, and had learned enough Apache words to conduct basic conversations without Taima's constant translation. But the peace she'd begun to feel that first evening had proven fragile and temporary. Kuruk's hostility hadn't diminished with time. If anything, it had intensified into something darker and more dangerous. He watched her constantly, with eyes full of barely contained rage, waiting for any opportunity to strike. Twice more he'd confronted her when she was with other women, backing down only when Taima or other warriors intervened. The situation was creating tension throughout the village, forcing people to choose sides between respecting their chief's decision to grant sanctuary and understanding Kuruk's grief-driven need for vengeance. This morning, Celia woke before dawn to a commotion outside her wickiup. Voices were raised in urgent discussion, and she could hear horses being prepared and weapons being gathered. She emerged to find the village in organized chaos, warriors preparing for what was clearly a significant expedition. Taima was among them, checking his rifle and securing supplies to his horse with grim efficiency. When he saw her, he broke away from the preparations to approach. Scouts reported cavalry movement 2 days' ride from here, he explained without preamble. A large patrol, maybe 50 soldiers, moving through territory they have no right to enter. We must go determine their intentions and make sure they do not find our village. His expression was serious, the weight of responsibility clear in every line of his face. I will be gone perhaps 4 or 5 days, maybe longer depending on what we find. Celia felt her stomach drop. The thought of Taima leaving, of losing her primary protector when Kuruk's animosity remained so intense, was terrifying. Is that wise, leaving now with everything so unsettled here? She kept her voice low, not wanting to sound like she was questioning his judgment, but the fear was impossible to hide completely. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Taima's expression softened slightly as he understood her concern. I have spoken with my aunt. Desba will watch over you while I am gone. She has authority in the village that even Kuruk will not challenge openly. And I have made it very clear to everyone that any harm coming to you during my absence will be answered when I return." He placed a hand briefly on her shoulder, a gesture of reassurance. "You are stronger now than when you arrived. You have friends among the women. Trust in this." Before Celia could respond, Nochalo called out, summoning the warriors to final council before departure. Timer squeezed her shoulder once more, then returned to his horse, swinging into the saddle with practiced ease. Within minutes, the entire war party, perhaps 20 warriors in total, rode out of the village in a cloud of dust. Celia watched them disappear into the forest with a sense of foreboding she couldn't shake. The first 2 days of Timer's absence passed without major incident. Celia threw herself into her work with even more dedication than usual, helping Desbar and the other women with food preparation, hide tanning, and gathering expeditions into the surrounding forest. The physical labor helped distract her from constant worry about both Timer's safety and her own vulnerable position. Desbar seemed to sense her anxiety and kept her close, assigning tasks that kept them working side by side, where the older woman's protective presence was most effective. But on the third morning, everything changed. Celia woke to find Kimmy outside her wickiup, the young woman's usually cheerful face tight with worry. She gestured urgently for Celia to follow, leading her not toward the day's work area, but toward the center of the village where a crowd had gathered. Pushing through the assembled people, Celia saw what had caused the commotion and felt her blood turn to ice. Maxwell Cordell stood in the middle of the village, flanked by 4 rough-looking men who were clearly hired guns rather than legitimate lawmen. Cordell himself looked somewhat the worse for wear after what must have been a difficult journey to find this place. His once immaculate suit, dusty and travel-stained, his face burned by sun. But his eyes held the same cold determination she remembered, the absolute certainty that he would prevail and claim what he believed belonged to him. How he had found her here, how he'd even known where to look, Celia couldn't begin to guess. Nochalo stood facing Cordell, with several of the remaining warriors at his back, the chief's weathered face impassive as Cordell spoke at length. One of Cordell's men was attempting to translate, his Apache clearly rudimentary and heavily accented, but enough to convey the basic message. Cordell was demanding Celia's return, claiming she was his legal ward and fiancée who had fled Philadelphia in a state of mental confusion. He was offering payment for her return, producing official-looking documents that meant nothing to people who lived outside the reach of American law. Celia's legs felt weak as she watched the exchange, memories of Cordell's threats flooding back with nauseating clarity. She'd been foolish to think distance and Apache protection could truly keep her safe. Foolish to believe that a man with Cordell's resources and obsessive determination would ever simply give up. Desbar appeared at her side, the older woman's presence steadying even as her expression remained troubled. Nochalo listened to Cordell's demands with patient courtesy, then spoke in measured Apache that the translator struggled to convey. The chief was explaining that Celia had come to them, seeking sanctuary, that she was under Apache protection, that no white man's papers held authority in this place. Cordell's expression darkened as the translation reached him, his cultivated mask of reasonableness beginning to crack. "I don't think you understand the situation," Cordell said, his voice rising with barely controlled anger. "That woman is legally mine. I have every right to retrieve what belongs to me, and I'm willing to pay handsomely for your cooperation." He produced a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. "Gold, enough to buy rifles and ammunition, supplies your people clearly need. All I ask is that you return my wayward fiancé, and will leave in peace." The translator conveyed this offer, and Celia saw several of the younger warriors exchange interested glances. Gold and guns were indeed valuable commodities that could significantly improve the village's defensive capabilities. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought Nochalo might actually consider the offer, might decide that one white woman wasn't worth refusing such resources. But the chief's expression remained unchanged as he delivered his response. The translator's face showed confusion as he struggled with Nochalo's words, but the essential message came through. Chief says woman is guest, not prisoner to be sold. Apache honor does not permit selling people for gold. You should leave now before you give offense that cannot be forgiven. The warning was clear enough even through the awkward translation. Cordell's face flushed red with anger and frustration. His hand moved toward the pistol at his hip, and immediately every Apache warrior present had weapons drawn and ready. The tension ratcheted impossibly higher. The moment balanced on a knife's edge between negotiation and violence. Cordell's hired men had also drawn their guns, but they were clearly calculating the odds and finding them unfavorable. 5 men against perhaps 15 Apache warriors on Apache territory, surrounded by forest that could hide countless more fighters. This isn't over, Cordell said finally, forcing his hand away from his weapon and gesturing for his men to lower theirs. I'll return with more men, with cavalry backing if necessary. That woman is mine by right of law, and I will have her. He fixed his cold gaze on Celia, who stood frozen behind the protective screen of villagers. You can't hide forever, Cecilia. Eventually, you'll have to face the consequences of your actions. Nochalo spoke again, his tone now carrying unmistakable command. The translator's voice shook slightly as he conveyed the message. Chief says you leave now. Take your men and your gold. Return with soldiers and Apache will be gone, village empty. You will never find us again. Woman stays under our protection. This is final word. For a long moment, Cordell seemed to consider pushing the confrontation further, perhaps hoping that sheer audacity might carry the day. But even his arrogance had limits when faced with drawn weapons and overwhelming numbers. He spat in the dirt, a gesture of contempt and frustrated rage, then turned sharply and stalked toward where their horses were held. His men followed quickly, clearly relieved to be leaving without bloodshed. The villagers watched in tense silence as Cordell and his party mounted and rode away, not relaxing until the sounds of their departure had faded completely into the forest. Then voices erupted in agitated discussion, different people offering opinions on what had just transpired and what it might mean for their safety. Celia stood rooted in place, trembling with reaction to the close call, barely able to process what had happened. Desbar took her firmly by the arm and led her away from the crowd, back toward the wiki-up they'd been sharing since Timer's departure. Once inside, the older woman made Celia sit and pressed a cup of water into her shaking hands. She spoke in Apache, her tone both scolding and comforting, and though Celia couldn't understand all the words, the essential message was clear. She was safe, the village had protected her. But this situation had become more complicated and dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Guruk appeared in the wiki-up entrance before Celia had fully recovered her composure, his scarred face twisted with fury. He spoke rapidly and harshly, pointing at Celia while directing his words at Desbar. The headwoman responded with equal heat, her voice rising to match his as she defended whatever position she was taking. The argument continued for several minutes, drawing a crowd of interested observers, until finally Kuruk made a disgusted gesture and stormed away. Kimi entered once Kuruk had left, her expression troubled. She sat beside Celia and began speaking slowly in a mixture of Apache and the few English words she'd learned, using gestures to fill in gaps. Gradually, Celia understood what Kuruk had been demanding. He wanted her expelled from the village immediately, arguing that her presence would bring cavalry down on them, that protecting one white woman wasn't worth risking the entire community. It was a reasonable argument, one that Celia herself had considered and couldn't entirely disagree with. Maybe he's right, Celia said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe I should leave before Cordell returns with soldiers. I never meant to bring danger to your people. The guilt was overwhelming. The realization that her desperate flight had potentially put innocent people in harm's way. Desbar seemed to understand the gist of Celia's words even without perfect translation. She responded firmly, gripping Celia's chin and forcing eye contact, speaking with an intensity that transcended language barriers. Kimi translated haltingly. Aunt Desbar says running brings danger everywhere. White men always find reasons to hurt Apache. Your presence changes nothing about that truth. Better to stand together than scatter in fear." Before Celia could respond, a young boy burst into the wickiup, speaking urgently. Desba's expression shifted from determined to alarmed, and she immediately rose, gesturing for Celia and Kimmy to follow. They emerged to find the village in chaos once again, but this time the cause was different. Scouts had returned with news that Timer's war party had engaged the cavalry patrol, and there had been fighting. Several warriors were wounded, and they were returning to the village earlier than expected. The next hours passed in a blur of anxious activity as the village prepared to receive their returning warriors and tend to any wounded. Women gathered medical supplies, prepared spaces for treating injuries, and maintained vigil near the edge of the village, watching for the first signs of the war party's approach. Celia helped where she could, following Desba's instructions for preparing bandages and heating water, trying to keep her hands busy so her mind wouldn't spiral into worst-case scenarios about Timer's fate. It was late afternoon when the lookouts finally called out that the warriors were approaching. The entire village rushed to meet them, and Celia's heart nearly stopped when she saw the condition of the returning men. 3 warriors were being carried on makeshift litters, clearly badly wounded. Others showed signs of injury, blood-stained clothing and makeshift bandages, exhausted faces marked by pain and recent combat. Timer rode among them, and relief flooded through Celia when she confirmed he appeared uninjured, though his face was grim and his clothing spattered with blood that might or might not be his own. The village immediately organized itself for crisis response. The wounded were brought to the largest wickiup where the healers could work on them. Women rushed to bring food and water for the exhausted warriors. Children were shooed away from the injured men, while being pressed into service carrying supplies. In the organized chaos, Celia found herself working alongside Desba to assist the healers, holding men down while bullets were extracted or wounds were cleaned and stitched. It was brutal. Visceral work that made her Philadelphia upbringing seem impossibly distant and irrelevant. These men had been shot, slashed, broken in combat with soldiers who saw them as obstacles to be eliminated rather than people defending their homeland. The reality of frontier violence, of the ongoing war between Apache people and encroaching settlers, became horrifyingly concrete as Celia watched healers work desperately to save lives. One of the wounded men, a warrior named Nietzsche, who'd always been kind to Celia despite her outsider status, gripped her hand with desperate strength as the healer probed for a bullet lodged near his spine. His pain-glazed eyes fixed on her face, and he spoke in gasping Apache that she couldn't fully understand, but that carried clear meaning. He was asking if he would survive, if his wife and children would be cared for. All the universal fears of a wounded warrior facing his possible death. Celia held his hand and spoke softly in English, knowing he probably couldn't understand her words, but hoping her tone conveyed comfort and reassurance. "You're going to be fine. The healers are skilled and you're strong. Your family needs you, so you have to fight to stay with them." She kept talking, a steady stream of encouragement and hope, while the healer worked and Nietzsche's grip on her hand grew tighter with each wave of agony. When the bullet was finally extracted and the wound packed with medicinal herbs and bound, Nietzsche's grip slowly loosened as exhaustion and relief overwhelmed him. Desba touched Celia's shoulder approvingly, her expression showing respect for how Celia had handled the difficult situation. They moved to the next wounded man, and then the next, working late into the night until all 3 critical patients had been stabilized and the walking wounded had been treated. Yes, it was well past midnight when Celia finally stumbled out of the healer's wickiup, her dress soaked with blood and sweat, her entire body trembling with exhaustion. She made her way toward the stream that ran near the village, desperate to wash away the physical evidence of the night's trauma. The cold water shocked her system as she scrubbed at the blood on her hands and arms, watching it swirl away in dark clouds under the moonlight. "You did well tonight," Timer's voice came from behind her, and she turned to find him standing a respectful distance away. his own appearance showing signs of the recent combat. Nietzsche told me you stayed with him through the worst of his treatment, that your presence gave him strength to endure. This is not small thing. Celia's composure, which had held throughout the crisis, finally cracked. Tears began streaming down her face, all the fear and stress and horror of the past day overwhelming her defenses. "Cordell was here," she said, her voice breaking. "While you were gone, he came with men and gold, demanding my return. Nochello refused him, but he threatened to come back with cavalry. And now you've fought soldiers, men are wounded, and it's all because I brought danger here." Timer closed the distance between them in 3 quick strides, pulling her into an embrace that was both comforting and possessive. "This is not your fault," he said firmly, his voice rumbling through his chest where her face pressed against him. "We have fought cavalry many times before you came. We will fight them many times after. This is reality of Apache life, defending our land and our people against those who would destroy us. You did not create this conflict, but I made it worse," Celia insisted, pulling back slightly to look up at his face. "Cordell will come back. He'll bring soldiers specifically to find me, and your village will be caught in the middle. Maybe Kuruk is right. Maybe I should leave before more people are hurt because of me." Timer's hands tightened on her shoulders, his expression fierce. "Where would you go? Back to Cordell's control? Alone into wilderness, where you would die within days? You think I would allow this after promising you protection?" He shook his head emphatically. "No, you stay here where we can defend you. If Cordell returns with cavalry, we will deal with that when it comes. Apache have been hiding from soldiers for generations. We know how to disappear, how to protect what matters." "I matter?" Celia asked softly, hardly daring to voice the question. "Enough to risk your community's safety? Enough to potentially bring war to your doorstep?" Timer's expression softened, and he reached up to gently wipe tears from her cheeks with his thumb. "You matter more than you know. Not just because I made promise to protect you, though that alone would be enough, but because you have become part of this community, have proven your worth through work and courage and willingness to learn our ways." He hesitated, then added with startling vulnerability, "And because you have become important to me personally, in ways I did not expect when I first found you hiding behind that tavern." The admission hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither was quite ready to fully explore. Celia's heart raced as she processed what he was saying. The suggestion that his protection might have evolved beyond simple honor into something deeper and more personal. Before she could formulate a response, voices called out from the village, someone looking for Timer with news about the wounded. "We will speak more of this later," Timer said, stepping back reluctantly. "For now, rest. Tomorrow we must make plans for the village's protection, decide if we should move camp or prepare for possible attack. I will need you strong and clear-headed to help with these decisions." The fact that he included her in the planning process, treated her as someone whose input mattered, was not lost on Celia. As they walked back toward the village together, Celia felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her. Stay and potentially bring destruction to people who had shown her kindness, or leave and face certain capture by Cordell. Risk Timer's life by accepting his protection, or strike out alone and almost certainly die in the wilderness. Every option seemed to lead to tragedy, and she had no idea which path would cause the least harm. But as they reached the edge of the village, and Timer squeezed her hand once, in silent reassurance, before heading toward where the men were gathered in council, Celia realized something important. For the first time since fleeing Philadelphia, she wasn't alone in facing these impossible choices. She had allies, a community that had proven willing to defend her, and a man who had vowed she would never need to fear again. Whatever came next, whatever consequences resulted from Cordell's pursuit, she wouldn't face them alone. That knowledge didn't make the fear disappear or the choices any easier, but it transformed her perspective on what was possible. Maybe survival wasn't just about running or hiding or hoping to remain unnoticed. Maybe it was about standing with others, about accepting help and offering it in return, about building connections strong enough to weather whatever storms were coming. As Celia finally made her way to her wiki-up for what little remained of the night, she carried that thought with her like a small flame against the darkness. Dawn broke with a crimson sky that the Apache interpreted as an omen, blood on the horizon warning of violence to come. Celia woke to find the village already dismantling itself with practiced efficiency that spoke of generations forced to relocate quickly when danger approached. Wiki-ups were being taken down, their poles bundled for transport, hides and brush coverings rolled and secured. Women packed essential supplies, while children were assigned tasks appropriate to their ages, even the youngest helping to gather belongings. The decision had clearly been made during the night council to abandon this location before Cordell could return with reinforcements. Desma appeared at Celia's wiki-up with a pack already prepared, gesturing for her to gather only what she could carry. The message was clear. They were moving light and fast, leaving behind anything that would slow them down. Celia rolled her few possessions into a blanket, the deerskin dress she'd arrived in, a few tools the women had given her, the derringer she still carried, though she'd never successfully fired it. Everything she owned in the world fit into a bundle small enough to tie across her back. Within 2 hours, the village had been transformed from a settled community into a mobile band ready to disappear into the wilderness. Lochelot gave orders in his calm, authoritative voice, organizing people into groups for the march. The wounded from the cavalry fight were secured on travois that would be pulled by horses, Nietzsche among them, though he protested weakly that he could walk. Scouts had already been sent ahead to identify the safest route and watch for any signs of pursuit. Timer found Celia as the column was preparing to depart, his expression serious but not frightened. We go north into the mountains where cavalry horses cannot easily follow. There are canyons there that have hidden Apache people for generations, places where even determined hunters lose the trail. He adjusted the pack on her shoulders, checking that it was properly balanced. The journey will be hard, 3 days of difficult travel. Stay close to Kimmy and the other women. If we are attacked, they will know what to do. The matter-of-fact way he spoke of potential attack made Celia's stomach clench with anxiety, but she nodded, understanding. Where will you be? She tried to keep the fear out of her voice, tried to sound capable and calm. But the thought of being separated from him during the vulnerable journey was terrifying. With the warriors watching our back trail and flanks, Timer replied. This is how we survive. Men fight, while women and children move to safety. Trust in our experience. We have done this many times before. He paused, then added more softly, and I will always know where you are. My eyes will find you even across distance. The promise in his words went beyond simple protection, carrying implications that made Celia's heart race. The column began moving, a long line of people and horses winding away from the village site toward the tree line. Celia walked with the other women, matching their steady pace that could be maintained for hours. Behind them, a group of warriors remained to obscure their trail, using techniques Timer had once described, brushing away footprints, creating false trails, doing everything possible to make tracking the band difficult. Ahead, scouts ranged far forward to ensure they weren't walking into an ambush. The first day of travel was grueling. They followed game trails that wound through dense forest and up steep slopes, the altitude increasing steadily as they moved into mountain territory. Celia's legs burned with exertion, her lungs struggling with the thin air, but she kept pace through sheer determination. Around her, women carried heavy packs while managing children, somehow maintaining conversation and even occasional laughter despite the circumstances. Their resilience was humbling and inspiring. They stopped briefly at midday for water and a sparse meal, then continued without significant rest. Celia noticed how the women rotated positions in the line, the strongest taking turns at the front where breaking trail required most energy, others moving to help with children or assist the elderly. It was community cooperation at its most essential, everyone contributing according to their abilities to ensure the group's survival. She found herself helping to carry a small child who had grown too tired to walk, the weight adding to her burden, but somehow making her feel more connected to the collective effort. As afternoon shadows lengthened, they finally stopped to make camp in a narrow canyon with high walls that provided natural defense. No fires were lit to avoid smoke that might reveal their location. The evening meal was cold jerky and water, eaten quickly before people settled for rest. Celia found a spot near Desba and the other women, her exhausted body grateful for the chance to stop moving, even as her mind raced with worries about what might be pursuing them. Taima appeared out of the darkness like a ghost, crouching beside where Celia lay, wrapped in her blanket. "No signs of pursuit yet," he reported quietly. "But Cordell knows this territory is dangerous for white men. He will gather more men, better trackers, before following. This gives us time to reach the deep canyons, where we have advantages." He studied her face in the dim starlight. "How do you fare?" "The pace is hard for someone not raised to this life. I'm managing," Celia replied, refusing to complain even though every muscle ached and her feet were raw with blisters. "The women have been kind, helping me when I struggle. I won't be the one who slows us down." The determination in her voice made Taima smile slightly. "You have a Apache heart now," he said with approval. "When you first arrived, I thought you were like delicate eastern flower that would wilt under frontier sun. But you are more like desert cactus, soft appearance hiding thorns and strength beneath." He reached out to touch her face gently, his calloused fingers surprisingly tender against her cheek. "This pleases me more than I can say." Before Celia could respond to this declaration, a soft whistle cut through the darkness, the signal Taima had been waiting for. He stood immediately, his warrior instincts taking precedence over personal feelings. "Sleep now. We move again before dawn." Then he melted back into the shadows to confer with the other warriors, leaving Celia with her heart pounding and her thoughts in turmoil. The second day proved even more challenging than the first. They left the forested slopes behind and entered true canyon country, a maze of red rock formations carved by ancient water into fantastic shapes. The trails here were treacherous, requiring careful navigation along narrow ledges with sheer drops on one side. Several times, they had to rope the horses down steep sections, the animals' eyes showing white with fear as they trusted human guidance over their own instincts. Celia's fear of heights made every step along the exposed sections an exercise in courage. She kept her eyes fixed on the path immediately before her, refusing to look down at the dizzying drops, following exactly in the footsteps of the woman ahead. When they finally reached the bottom of a particularly harrowing descent, she found herself shaking with reaction and relief. Kimmy noticed her distress and squeezed her arm reassuringly, speaking in the mixture of Apache and English they'd developed. "You are brave. Many white people freeze on high paths, cannot move. But you keep walking, keep trusting. This is good." The simple praise meant more to Celia than elaborate compliments had ever meant in Philadelphia's drawing rooms. That night they camped in a hidden canyon that could only be accessed through a narrow slot canyon, barely wide enough for a horse. The high walls and single entrance made it easily defensible, and for the first time since leaving the village, fires were allowed. The warmth and hot food lifted everyone's spirits considerably. Children who had been silent and serious during the march began playing again, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls. Women gathered around fires to talk and work on small tasks, creating moments of normalcy within the disrupted circumstances. Celia sat with Desba and several other women, her hands automatically working to repair a torn pack strap while they conversed. She could understand more of their Apache now, catching perhaps one word in three, enough to follow the general topics, if not every detail. They were discussing the canyon country ahead, debating which route would be safest, sharing memories of other times they'd hidden in these ancient stone mazes. A sharp whistle from the canyon entrance brought instant silence and alertness. Warriors moved quickly to defensive positions, while women gathered children close. Taima appeared beside the fire, his expression tense. Riders approaching, not many, perhaps 3 or 4. They will reach the slot canyon within an hour. His eyes found Celia across the fire. If they are Cordell's men, we may have to fight to keep them from discovering this camp. Nochalo emerged from where he'd been resting, instantly taking command despite his age. He issued rapid orders, and warriors began preparing for potential combat. Women were instructed to move deeper into the canyon with the children and wounded, creating distance from any fighting that might occur at the entrance. Celia found herself being herded along with the others, frustration rising at being relegated to helpless observer while others prepared to risk their lives. But as they moved through the darkness toward the rear of the canyon, Celia realized this wasn't about helplessness, but about tactical sense. If fighting did break out, the warriors needed to focus entirely on the threat without worrying about non-combatants caught in the crossfire. By moving to safety, the women and children freed the men to fight with full effectiveness. It was practical cooperation, not gender-based weakness. They waited in tense silence while scouts crept forward to identify the approaching riders. Time seemed to stretch impossibly, each minute feeling like an hour, while Celia's imagination conjured terrible scenarios of Cordell's men discovering the camp, of violence erupting, of Taima being hurt or killed defending her. The guilt was crushing, the knowledge that her presence had brought this danger to people who had shown her nothing but increasing acceptance and kindness. Finally, a scout returned with news that sent relief rippling through the gathered people. The riders were not Cordell's men, but Apache from another band, seeking news and warning of increased cavalry activity throughout the territory. They were allies, not threats, bringing information that would help Nochalo make strategic decisions about where to go next. The camp gradually returned to normal as the visiting warriors were welcomed and fed, their leader conferring at length with Nochalo by firelight. Celia returned to her spot by the women's fire, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline that had flooded her system during the scare. Desba handed her a cup of herbal tea, the older woman's expression understanding, even without words. Later that night, after the visiting warriors had been given a place to sleep and the camp had settled into rest, Taima once again sought out Celia. This time he took her hand and led her away from the main camp to where a large boulder provided both seats and privacy. The canyon walls rose dark and imposing around them, the stars overhead brilliant in the clear mountain air. "We must talk," Taima said without preamble. "About what comes next, about the future beyond simply running from Cordell." His voice carried a seriousness that made Celia's pulse quicken. "What do you mean?" she asked, though part of her already suspected where this conversation was heading, could feel the shift in their relationship that had been building over weeks of shared danger and gradual understanding. Taima took both her hands in his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that was almost overwhelming. "Among my people, when a warrior gives protection to a woman, when he makes promise to defend her with his life, this can become more than duty. It can become something deeper if both people wish it." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "You came to us as refugee, as guest under my protection. But you have become more than this. You work beside our women. You help tend our wounded. You walk our hardest trails without complaint. You are becoming Apache in your heart." Celia's breath caught as she realized what he was suggesting, the implications of his words. "Taima, She started to speak, but he gently interrupted. "Let me finish, please. Among white people, I think women of your class would not choose Apache warrior, would not accept life of hardship and danger, of always moving, always fighting to survive. I understand this, but I must speak what is in my heart before it becomes too heavy to carry." He drew a deep breath. "I wish you to stay not as guest or refugee, but as my wife, to join your life to mine, to become fully part of our people with all the rights and protections that brings." The proposal struck Celia speechless. She'd known their relationship had been evolving. that the connection between them had deepened beyond protector and protected. But hearing it stated so directly forced her to confront feelings she'd been trying to keep contained. In Philadelphia, she'd been courted by wealthy men who offered social position and material comfort while seeing her primarily as ornament and possession. Timer was offering something completely different. Partnership in the truest sense, a life of shared struggle and mutual respect. "I know this is sudden," Timer continued when she didn't immediately respond. "I know you may need time to consider. But with Cordell still hunting you, with soldiers searching these territories, I want you to have the full protection that comes with being Apache wife, rather than just refugee under temporary sanctuary. If you are my wife, my entire band will defend you as one of their own. This is stronger protection than I alone can provide. Is that the only reason?" Celia asked softly, needing to understand his motivations. "For strategic protection." Even as she asked, she hoped desperately that there was more to it than practical considerations. Timer's expression softened, and he reached up to cup her face in his hands. "No, that is the reason I tell myself to justify these feelings that grow stronger each day. But the truth is simpler and more complicated." He smiled slightly. "I have come to care for you deeply, Celia Chamberlain. Your courage moves me. Your determination to adapt and learn. Your kindness to our people, despite having every reason to fear them. The way you held Nietzsche's hand while he suffered and gave him strength. These things have entered my heart and made a place there." Tears sprang to Celia's eyes as the sincerity of his words washed over her. For so long she'd been running from a man who wanted to own her, to possess her like property. And here was Timer, offering partnership, respect, genuine affection, without expectation of her surrender. It was everything she hadn't known she'd been searching for. "Yes," she whispered, the word escaping before she could fully think through all the implications. "Yes, I'll marry you. I'll stay and become part of your people, your life." The rightness of the decision resonated through her entire being, even as part of her mind recognized the enormity of what she was committing to. Timer's smile was like sunrise, transforming his usually serious face into something radiant. He pulled her into an embrace that was both tender and fierce, his lips finding hers in a kiss that sealed the promise between them. Celia melted into his arms, finally allowing herself to feel the full depth of emotion she'd been suppressing. The love that had been growing despite impossible circumstances. When they finally drew apart, both breathing hard, Timer rested his forehead against hers. "Tomorrow I will speak to Nochalo. We will have ceremony when we reach the permanent canyon camp, where my people can celebrate properly. But in my heart, you are already my wife, already bound to me." The possessiveness in his voice was nothing like Cordell's controlling ownership. It was the possessiveness of partnership, of choosing to belong to each other. They sat together under the stars for a long time, making plans and sharing hopes for a future that was uncertain but no longer solitary. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever dangers Cordell and the cavalry might bring, they would face them together. Celia had run from Philadelphia seeking freedom and found something far more valuable. A place to belong, people who valued her for her character rather than her social connections, and a man who saw her strength even when she doubted it herself. As they finally made their way back to the camp to sleep, Celia felt a peace she'd never experienced in her previous life. Yes, they were refugees fleeing pursuit. Yes, hardship and danger lay ahead. But she was no longer alone, no longer defined by fear. She was Timer's chosen partner, becoming Apache in her heart, building a new identity from courage and love rather than social obligation. And somehow that transformation felt like finally coming home. The permanent canyon camp revealed itself like a secret kept by the mountains themselves. A vast, hidden valley, accessible only through a series of narrow passages that could be defended by a handful of warriors against an army. Water flowed year-round from springs that fed a clear stream, and the valley floor provided enough grazing for horses and space for crops during growing season. Ancient pictographs decorated the canyon walls, evidence that Apache people had sheltered here for generations, perhaps centuries. As Celia emerged from the final narrow passage and saw the valley spreading before her, she understood why Timer had spoken of this place with such reverence. The band settled quickly into the established camp, wiki-ups rising in familiar patterns as people reclaimed spaces they'd occupied during previous retreats to this sanctuary. The wounded were made comfortable in a sheltered area near the healing springs, where mineral-rich water was said to speed recovery. Children who had been subdued during the dangerous journey now ran freely, their voices echoing off canyon walls as they rediscovered favorite playing spots. The transformation from hunted refugees to secure community happened with remarkable speed. Celia found herself swept into preparations for her wedding ceremony, which Nocciolo had declared would take place in 3 days once everyone had recovered from the journey. Desba took charge of the arrangements with an enthusiasm that suggested she'd been hoping for exactly this outcome. The older woman gathered other women to help prepare Celia's wedding dress, a beautiful garment of white doeskin decorated with intricate beadwork that had belonged to Timer's mother. The fact that Desba was willing to share such a precious family heirloom spoke volumes about her acceptance of Celia into the family. Gimme helped Celia understand the significance of various wedding traditions, explaining through their shared vocabulary and enthusiastic gestures how the ceremony would unfold. There would be gift exchanges, blessings from the elders, a feast that the entire band would contribute to and share. Most importantly, there would be public acknowledgement that Celia was no longer an outsider seeking temporary sanctuary, but a full member of the community through her marriage to one of their respected warriors. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and warm, the canyon filled with golden light that seemed to bless the occasion. Women helped Celia dress in the white doeskin, braiding her auburn hair with special care and weaving in small white shells and turquoise beads. They painted her face with traditional designs, ochre and white clay applied in patterns that marked transitions and new beginnings. When they finally allowed her to see her reflection in the polished metal mirror, Celia barely recognized herself. The Philadelphia society woman had disappeared entirely, replaced by someone who belonged to this land and these people. Timer waited for her in the center of camp, dressed in his finest ceremonial clothing, his face solemn, but his eyes shining with unmistakable joy when he saw her approach. Nocciolo stood beside him, prepared to conduct the ceremony that would bind their lives together. The entire band had gathered in a circle around them. Even the wounded who could walk had come to witness and celebrate. The sense of community support was overwhelming and deeply moving. The ceremony itself was beautiful in its simplicity and profound in its meaning. Nocciolo spoke of the responsibilities of marriage, of the importance of partnership and mutual respect, of how two individuals choosing to walk life's path together made both stronger. Timer and Celia exchanged gifts, he presenting her with a knife in a beautifully beaded sheath, she giving him a shirt she'd spent weeks secretly sewing with help from the other women. These practical gifts symbolized their commitment to provide for and protect each other. When Nocciolo finally declared them married in the eyes of the people and the spirits, Timer pulled Celia close and kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. The gathered band erupted in celebration, voices raised in traditional songs that spoke of love and partnership and the continuation of the people. For the first time since fleeing Philadelphia, Celia felt completely free, no longer running from a past that threatened to destroy her, but actively choosing a future she wanted to build. The feast that followed was abundant and joyous, everyone contributing what they could to honor the new couple. There was roasted meat and corn cakes, wild berries and nuts, dishes Celia had learned to prepare alongside foods that were still exotic to her palate. Stories were shared and songs sung, the celebration continuing late into the night as the community embraced this moment of joy amid the ongoing challenges of their existence. As darkness fell and the celebration gradually wound down, Timer led Celia to a wiki-up that had been prepared for them at the edge of the camp. positioned to provide both privacy and beautiful views of the valley. Inside, blankets and furs had been arranged to create a comfortable space, and a small fire burned in the central pit, casting dancing shadows on the walls. This was their home now, the place where they would build their life together. Taimar helped Celia remove the ceremonial beadwork from her hair, his fingers gentle and patient with the intricate fastenings. "Are you happy?" he asked softly, searching her face for any sign of regret or doubt. "This life is so different from what you knew. If you have uncertainty, you can tell me." Celia placed her hand over his, stilling his movements. "I have no uncertainty," she said firmly. "For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, with exactly who I'm meant to be with. Everything I lost when I fled Philadelphia, all the comfort and security I left behind, it means nothing compared to what I found here." She paused, emotion making her voice thick. "You gave me more than protection, Taimar. You gave me the freedom to become who I truly am." His kiss was her answer, deep and passionate, and full of promise for the future they would share. As they came together as husband and wife, Celia felt the final chains of her old life fall away. She was no longer Cecilia Chamberlain of Philadelphia, no longer the frightened woman hiding behind a tavern. She was Celia, wife of Taimar, daughter of the Apache people, a woman who had run toward freedom and found love. The peaceful days that followed seemed almost too perfect to last, and Celia's instincts proved correct. 2 weeks after the wedding, scouts brought news that a large cavalry patrol had been asking questions in settlements near the canyon lands, accompanied by a civilian who matched Cordell's description. The man was offering substantial rewards for information about Apache camps, specifically mentioning a white woman being held captive. His persistence was as impressive as it was terrifying. A council was called to discuss the threat and determine appropriate response. Celia attended as Taimar's wife, no longer excluded from strategic discussions. The debate was intense, some warriors arguing for a preemptive strike against the cavalry patrol, others advocating for simply disappearing deeper into the canyon country. Guruk, who had maintained hostile silence since Celia's wedding, finally spoke, his voice carrying resigned acceptance rather than anger. He argued that they should send scouts to mislead Cordell and the cavalry away from the canyon camp, protecting the community while addressing the threat. To Celia's surprise, Guruk's plan was sound and practical, showing genuine concern for the band's welfare, rather than simply using the situation to argue for her expulsion. When the council adjourned with Nochelo's decision to implement a modified version of Guruk's strategy, Celia approached the scarred warrior, her heart pounding with nervousness. "I know you have every reason to hate me," she said quietly and halting Apache, the words carefully prepared with Taimar's help. "I know my presence has brought danger and that I can never replace what you lost. But I am grateful that you put the people's safety above your anger. This shows true warrior's heart." She bowed her head respectfully, acknowledging his grief and his strength. Guruk studied her for a long moment, his scarred face unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough but not hostile. "My wife would not want me to harm innocent woman because of my pain. She always said that hatred only feeds on itself until it consumes everything good. I'm trying to honor her memory by not letting grief turn me into something she would be ashamed of." He paused, then added, "You are Apache now, sister to my brother-in-arms. I will defend you as I would defend any of our people." The olive branch was unexpected and deeply moving. Celia felt tears prick her eyes as she thanked him, understanding that his acceptance represented the final barrier to her full integration into the community. If Guruk, who had most reason to resent her, could find peace with her presence, then she truly had become one of the people. The scouts departed the next morning to execute their misleading strategy, leaving false trails and spreading rumors designed to send Cordell and the cavalry searching in wrong directions. Days passed in tense waiting, everyone listening for sounds of pursuit or discovery. But the scouts' work proved effective. and gradually the immediate threat seemed to recede as Cordel's search moved away from their hidden valley. Life settled into new rhythms as Celia fully embraced her role as Timer's wife and member of the Apache community. She learned more of the language daily, her vocabulary expanding to include not just practical words, but the poetry and philosophy embedded in Apache speech. She mastered skills she'd never imagined needing: tracking animals, reading weather signs, identifying edible and medicinal plants by subtle characteristics. Her hands, once soft and useless, became capable and strong. Autumn arrived with spectacular color painting the canyon walls, and with it came news from friendly bands that Cordell had finally given up his search and returned east. The cavalry patrol he'd been with had suffered losses in an unrelated skirmish and had withdrawn from the territory. Whether Cordell would return someday remained uncertain, but for now the immediate threat had passed. On a cool evening, as the first snow dusted the high peaks surrounding their valley, Celia sat with Timer outside their wickiup, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Her hand rested on her belly, where new life was just beginning to make itself known, a secret she was waiting for the right moment to share. The journey from terrified fugitive to content wife and soon-to-be mother seemed impossible when she reflected on it. Yet here she was. "What are you thinking?" Timer asked, noting her contemplative expression. "You have that look you get when your mind travels far from where you sit." Celia smiled and took his hand, placing it over her belly where their child grew. "I'm thinking about promises kept," she said softly. "You found me coward and shaking behind a tavern, running from a man who thought he owned me. You promised I would never need to fear anyone again, and you kept that promise, but you gave me so much more." Her voice grew thick with emotion. "You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You gave me freedom to become strong. You loved me when I couldn't love myself." Timer's expression transformed as he understood what her gesture meant, joy and wonder replacing his usual serious demeanor. "A child," he whispered, and at her nod he pulled her into an embrace that was both protective and exultant. "You have given me everything I never knew to hope for. My fierce eastern flower who became Apache warrior woman." As they sat together under the vast western sky, Celia reflected on the strange path that had brought her to this moment. She'd fled Philadelphia, believing she was running toward nothing more than escape from Cordell's control. Instead, she'd run toward a destiny she couldn't have imagined, toward a love that transcended cultural boundaries, toward a strength she'd discovered within herself when circumstances demanded it. The woman who had hidden trembling behind that tavern in Copper Ridge no longer existed. In her place was someone new, forged by hardship and shaped by love, tested by danger and proven by courage. Celia had learned that true freedom wasn't found in comfort or security, but in choosing your own path, even when that path was difficult. She'd learned that home wasn't a place, but people who valued you for who you truly were. And she'd learned that sometimes the greatest promises were kept not through grand gestures, but through daily acts of protection, respect, and partnership. Timer had vowed she would never fear again, and through his love and the acceptance of his people, that vow had become reality. Not because danger no longer existed, but because she'd found the strength to face it without being consumed by terror. As winter descended on the hidden valley and the Apache band settled into the season's rhythms, Celia looked toward the future with hope rather than fear. There would be challenges ahead, there always were on the frontier, but she would face them not as a frightened fugitive, but as an Apache wife, a valued member of the community, a woman who had claimed her freedom and built a life worth living. The story that had begun with desperate flight behind a dusty tavern had transformed into something far more meaningful. A tale of courage discovered, love found, and promises kept. And as Celia placed her hand over Timer's, where it rested protectively on her belly, she understood that this was only the beginning of the life they would build together in the shadow of the canyon walls, free and unafraid. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.